Beamy Logan, 24, worked nights at an Amazon warehouse. Not glamorous, not terrible, somewhere in the middle. The night shift guys are fine. We don't talk much. Everyone just does their thing. Come home at 6 in the morning, eat whatever's in the fridge, shower if I have energy, crash. Been doing this for about 2 years. The routine is basically perfect if your goal is to never think about the future. Apartment is small, 1 bedroom, near enough to the warehouse that I can walk when the weather is decent. I've got a gaming setup in the corner of the living room that cost more than my couch. The couch is the kind of thing you'd find outside a dorm building with a free sign on it. That tells you something about my priorities at the time. I'm not broke. I'm not building anything either. Just kind of existing in that middle space a lot of guys in their mid-20s end up in. You're not in school anymore. You're not yet doing the thing you'll eventually do. Just sort of idling, waiting for something to click. Nothing ever clicked, though, so I kept idling. That was my life before Lacey. Not unhappy, not really anything, just moving through days without much friction. Met Lacey through a mutual friend at a house party. She was the kind of person you notice immediately, not necessarily because of looks, but because of energy. She had opinions about everything, and she shared them without waiting to be asked. That sounds annoying, but in practice it was actually kind of magnetic. I'm the kind of guy who goes with the flow and can sit in silence for extended periods without it bothering me. So, someone who had strong feelings and knew how to articulate them felt interesting. We talked for a while that night. She was funny, sharp, had this way of making everything she said feel like it mattered. She taught yoga, had been doing it for a few years, had a small but steady client base. She talked a lot about wellness, mindset, the connection between physical and mental health. I nodded along like I understood more than I did. We exchanged numbers, started texting, went out a few times. By the time we were officially together, it had only been a few weeks. Things moved fast, but not in a way that felt pressured, just felt natural at the time. Early in the relationship, she was great company. She had direction and ambition, and she made me feel like being around someone like that was enough. Like proximity to a person who had things figured out counted for something. She'd come over after her evening classes, and we'd eat and watch stuff, and she'd talk about her day. I'd listen, ask questions, she'd keep going. I liked listening to her. She was interesting. She had a lot to say about wellness culture, about the yoga community, about her clients, and she had a lot to say about what she called toxic masculinity. This came up pretty regularly. Not always in a confrontational way, just as a lens she applied to things she saw or read. Some guy did something somewhere, some study came out, some public figure said something, and she'd take it apart and explain what it revealed about men and how men were socialized. I'd nod and say, yeah, makes sense, and she'd keep going. I didn't have strong feelings about most of it, one way or another. I just wasn't the kind of person who thought a lot about social theory at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday. She seemed to appreciate having a listener, so I kept listening. The dynamic was comfortable for a long time. She was the one with the strong opinions and the energy and the talking points. I was the one who was easy to be around and didn't push back. In retrospect, that's not really a relationship. That's more like a vibe. But at the time, I wasn't analyzing it. I was just in it. We'd go places together. She'd know more people than me wherever we went. I'd hang back a bit. I was the quiet one. She was the social one. I carried things and drove and agreed with her in public and at home. I don't say that bitterly. I was genuinely fine with it. I just wasn't paying attention to what was being established between us, the dynamic that was forming without either of us naming it. She was the one who had it together, and I was the one who was a work in progress. That's not a thing she said explicitly. It's just how things felt if you watched from outside. Her apartment was decorated, intentional, plants on every surface that were actually alive. She'd made a life that looked like a life. Mine looked like a waiting room, and I think being around her felt like proof of something I hadn't earned yet. Like if she chose to be with me, maybe I was further along than I thought, which is not a great reason to be in a relationship, but it was part of why I was in one. She introduced me to her friends as her boyfriend with this particular energy. Proud, but also slightly protective. Like here he is, still working on himself, but I see the potential. I felt it, but couldn't name it at the time. Her circle was full of people who had opinions and projects and directions, photographers, therapists, a guy who made ceramics and somehow paid his rent doing it. I'd sit at dinner with them and mostly listen. They weren't unfriendly. They just all seemed to have a thing. A thing they were doing or building or committed to. I was a warehouse worker who came home and played games. I didn't have a thing. At one of those dinners, someone asked what I was into, what I cared about. I gave some vague answer about just figuring things out, and the conversation moved on. Lacey touched my arm when it did. Supportive or rescue, hard to tell which. About 8 months in the cracks started to show in small ways. She'd mentioned things I hadn't done or remembered to do. Said I wasn't reliable enough, that she couldn't count on me for logistics. I'd forget things, show up unprepared, miss small stuff. I apologized each time and meant it, but the apologies were getting more frequent. She started keeping a kind of informal tally, or at least that's what it felt like. When something new happened, she'd reference 2 or 3 older things like they were still open cases. I'd feel bad about it, try harder for a while, then slip back. Not out of malice, just because I wasn't actually addressing the root problem. The root problem being that I wasn't really engaged in my own life, so I wasn't engaged in the relationship either, not in any active way. I was just there. The specific night everything changed was one I didn't see coming. She had some kind of gathering at a friend's place, a wellness thing, her yoga circle, people she knew from that world. She'd mentioned it, and I'd said I'd go. I genuinely intended to go. But she didn't set a reminder, and neither did I, and the whole thing just dropped out of my head. She showed up at my apartment to pick me up. I answered the door in sweats, snacks on the coffee table, something playing on the screen. The look on her face when she saw me is something I still remember clearly. Not explosive anger, something worse, actually. A kind of tired disappointment. Like she'd expected this and hoped she was wrong, and now she had confirmation. I apologized immediately, said I'd get changed, said we could still make it. She came in, sat on the couch, said it was fine. It was very obviously not fine. We stayed in, and the mood was gone. She was polite but distant, and I kept trying to read the room and do the right thing and failing. Eventually, she stopped being polite and just said what she was thinking. Went through a list of things, patterns she'd noticed, times I'd let her down. I sat there and took it all, nodding, not defending myself. And then she got to the part that hit differently. She looked right at me and said I was like a child. Said it plainly, not cruelly, not as a weapon exactly. Just stated it like a fact she'd been sitting with for a while. Said I needed to grow up. She went to the bathroom. I sat on the couch in the quiet. Not humiliated, not angry, just sitting with the words. And the thing that kept happening in my head was that I couldn't actually argue with them. I could argue with her delivery, or her tone, or the timing, but the content was accurate, and somewhere under everything I knew it was accurate. I needed to grow up. That was just true. She came back and we talked for a bit more. Nothing got resolved. She went home. I stayed up later than usual, not doing anything in particular, just kind of looking at the apartment. I'd lived there for almost 2 years, and I'd been the same person the whole time. Same plates in the same spots, same habits, same nothing on the walls. It wasn't depressing exactly. It was more like a held breath that had gone on too long. I went to bed eventually. Next morning woke up and did the thing I hadn't done in probably 18 months. dug out the gym bag from the closet, found clothes that still fit, walked to the 24-hour place 5 minutes away. Nobody there at that hour except a few other people with weird schedules. A guy doing deadlifts in complete silence, someone on a treadmill with headphones. That was it. I didn't have a plan, no program, no goals. Just showed up and did something for an hour and left. My legs were wrecked the next day in a way that told me how far things had slipped. I went back anyway. The day after that, too. The third day, my arms were also wrecked, but I went again. That was the whole beginning of it. No revelation, no dramatic decision, just consecutive days at the gym. I looked up some basic beginner programs online and followed one loosely. Nothing complicated, just a structure to keep me from wandering around aimlessly between machines. Started getting better at it slowly, the way you do when you just show up regularly. Form improved. The weights went up incrementally. The exhaustion after became a good kind of tired instead of a bad kind. I started looking forward to the mornings in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a while. The hour before the shift was mine in a way that the rest of the day wasn't. Nobody needed anything from me. Nobody was watching. I was just there doing something physical and simple. It cleared my head out in a way I hadn't expected. The following week, I started looking at my spending. Not because it was in crisis, just because I realized I had no idea where my money was going. Opened the banking app and went back through a few months. The honest answer was food delivery, random online purchases, subscriptions I'd forgotten about. Not catastrophic, but also just completely purposeless. I was spending money the way I was living, just letting it go wherever without thinking. There was 1 month where I'd spent more on delivery fees alone than on groceries. Sat with that for a minute. You don't feel like you're making bad decisions in the moment. Each individual order makes sense. You're tired. You don't have anything in the fridge. But when you see it all laid out, it looks like a different person made those choices. Started cooking more. Nothing impressive. Eggs and rice and pasta, stuff that required minimal skill and minimal money. Looked up a few basic recipes and made them badly until I made them adequately. The food delivery orders dropped significantly. The balance started growing. Canceled a few subscriptions I hadn't used in months either. Also put in the request to switch to the day shift. I'd been on nights for 2 years, and it paid slightly better, but I was spending the extra money on garbage anyway. The trade-off wasn't worth it anymore. They moved me over after a few weeks. And that one change restructured everything. Suddenly I was waking up like a normal person, getting tired at a normal hour, sleeping at a normal hour, having evenings that I was actually awake for. The gym became a morning thing before the shift. The apartment started getting cleaned more often because I had hours to fill that weren't 3 a.m. I started cooking dinner instead of ordering it. Started going to bed before midnight regularly. Which sounds like nothing, but it was genuinely new. I'd been treating sleep like an optional thing, and it had been wearing me down in ways I hadn't noticed until they stopped. Small, practical changes. Not a transformation, just a life that was starting to have actual structure. Lacey noticed pretty quickly. The gym thing especially. She'd comment on it warmly, but in a way that had this undertone of pleasant surprise, like she hadn't expected it to stick. She said things like, "That's really great. I'm glad you're doing that." Which is what you say to someone you had low expectations for. I noticed it, but didn't say anything about it. Partly because she wasn't wrong to have had low expectations, and partly because I wasn't doing any of this for her reaction. That was new for me. The gym, the savings, the shift change, none of it was about getting her approval. I wasn't thinking about her when I was doing those things. I was just doing them because they needed doing. And doing things without needing someone to validate them felt different. A little unfamiliar, actually kind of good. Things between us kept going, but the texture changed. She'd come over and tell me about her day, her classes, her clients, the drama in her yoga circle. I listened the same way I always had, but I wasn't performing interest the same way. Before, I would have asked follow-up questions, kept the conversation going, made sure she felt heard. Now, I listened genuinely, but when there was a natural pause, I let it be a pause. I didn't fill every silence with attention. She'd tell me about some frustration. I'd say that sounds annoying, and then go back to whatever I was doing. One time she was going through a long thing about something she'd read, about men and emotional availability. She got to the end of it and looked at me waiting for a reaction. I said, yeah, that's probably real for some people. She asked if I thought it was real for me. I said I didn't think it was the same situation. She pressed a little, asked what I meant. I said I was just trying to be more intentional about things, including how I showed up in relationships. She didn't know what to do with that answer. It wasn't dismissive, but it wasn't the engaged reaction she was used to either. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted slightly. She'd lost a little footing without either of us naming it. My friend came over sometime around then. We'd been less consistent about hanging out since I'd switched to days. He walked in and immediately noticed the apartment was different. Cleaner, more organized, food in the fridge that was actual food. Made a comment about it, half impressed, half suspicious. We went out to eat and he kept watching me. Eventually asked what was going on. I told him about the gym and the shift change and the savings stuff. He said, no, that's not it. Something else is different. I asked him what he meant. He said I seemed like I was actually paying attention to things, like I was present in a way I hadn't been before. Said most of the time when we'd hung out in the last year or so, I'd been kind of far away, even when I was there. I didn't have a great answer for that. Told him maybe I just needed the right thing to kick me into gear. He asked what the right thing was. I said honestly it was Lacey telling me I was like a child. He laughed. Not mocking, just found it genuinely funny. Said that was the most useful thing a girlfriend had ever done. I laughed too. We had a good night, talked for a long time. It was easy. I hadn't had a conversation like that in a while, where I wasn't half somewhere else. The dynamic with Lacey kept shifting in ways that were harder to ignore. She started doing this thing where she'd make small, pointed comments and then watch my reaction. The kind of comments that were observations on the surface, but were actually tests. She'd mention that a friend's boyfriend had just gotten promoted, or bought a place, or was taking courses. Not saying anything directly about me, just presenting information. The old move would have been for me to get a little defensive, or to explain myself, or to ask what I should be doing differently. I didn't do any of that. I just said that's cool, or yeah, good for him, and meant it without any anxiety underneath. She'd wait for more, and I wouldn't give more. The non-reaction seemed to frustrate her more than any actual argument would have. At least an argument is something to work with. Calm indifference is a different problem entirely. She brought up the toxic masculinity angle more directly after a while. Said something about how men who resist growing emotionally are basically taking from the women around them. Drawing on emotional labor without giving any back. Said it had been on her mind and she wanted to say it. I sat with it for a second, and then said that was probably fair in a lot of cases. She asked if I thought it applied to me. I said I thought it used to apply to me. She asked what changed. I said I'd just started actually trying to show up for myself, and that when you do that, you stop needing other people to do it for you. She looked at me for a moment. I think she was trying to figure out if I was being passive-aggressive. I wasn't. I was just saying what I thought. She said that wasn't exactly what she meant. I said okay and left it there. We moved on to other things, but the conversation kept pulling at something. There was a version of the relationship we'd been in that was based on her having things figured out and me being the one who needed guidance. That version had a shelf life, apparently. Got the team lead position not long after. It wasn't a huge leap. Still at the warehouse, still the same building. But it was a real change in responsibility. I had to think now, make decisions about scheduling and workflow, deal with conflicts between people. It was harder than just doing the physical work, but I was better at it than I expected. There was a satisfaction to problem solving that I hadn't really felt in a job before. Someone would come to me with a logistics issue, and I'd figure it out and move on. Small things, but they added up over the course of a day. I started understanding the operation in a way you can't from the floor. Why certain things were bottlenecked, where the inefficiencies were, which processes could be tightened. Made a few suggestions to my manager that got implemented. Nothing groundbreaking, but they noticed. The pay bump was real, and it went straight into savings. I told Lacey about it when it happened. She said that was great. She was happy for me. And then very quickly started talking about her own plans to expand her class schedule, which was fine. I was glad to hear it. But I noticed the conversation about my thing lasted maybe 30 seconds before becoming a springboard to her thing. I filed that away without making it into anything. Just a data point, the kind you don't act on but don't lose either. The texting pattern changed around this time. Lacey started reaching out more during the day, asking what I was up to, when I was free, suggesting plans, which was new because before I'd been the one doing most of the initiating. I was fine with it, responded when I could, kept things easy. But some of the messages had a tone that didn't match casual. If I didn't respond within a certain window, she'd follow up with something slightly pointed, asking if I was ignoring her or was just busy. I wasn't ignoring her. I was at work, or at the gym, or asleep at a normal hour like a person with a schedule. I'd explain and she'd be fine again, and then the same thing would happen a few days later. There was a shift in who was holding the tension in the relationship, and I don't think either of us had fully processed what that meant yet. She came over one evening with the energy of someone who'd been preparing what they were going to say, sat down, looked at me directly, said she needed to talk. I said okay and waited. She said she felt distance between us, said something had changed and she couldn't put her finger on exactly what. Said I seemed far away even when we were physically in the same room. Said she needed more from me, more presence, more engagement, more of the person she'd fallen for. I let her get through all of it. She also said she'd been thinking a lot about toxic masculinity and how one expression of it was emotional unavailability. Men who were physically present but mentally checked out. Men who made women feel like they were talking to a wall. Said she didn't want to be with someone like that. I noticed she was framing my being calmer and less reactive as emotional unavailability, as if the only way to be emotionally present was to be reactive to whatever she said. I let that go for the moment, and when she was done, I thought about it for a second. Then I said I wanted to make sure I understood what she was asking. Said she'd told me I needed to grow up. Said I'd taken that seriously. Said I'd tried to actually do it. Got more consistent, saved money, stopped drifting, started showing up for myself. And I asked what she was asking for now. Asked if she wanted me to go back to being the person she'd called a child. She said that wasn't what she meant. I said I wasn't trying to be difficult. I was genuinely asking, because from where I was sitting, the version of me she was saying felt far away was the improved version, and I wasn't sure how to reconcile that. She got very quiet, real quiet. The kind that means something is getting processed that's uncomfortable. She said she just wanted the closeness back. I said I didn't think the closeness was gone. I thought the dynamic had changed. Said what she used to call closeness felt a lot from the inside, like me needing her to feel okay, and I didn't need that in the same way anymore. She said that wasn't fair. I said maybe not, but it was honest. She sat there for a moment, and then said something interesting. Said that men pulling away and calling it growth was just another way of avoiding intimacy. Said she'd seen it before. This pattern where a man decides he's worked on himself and suddenly becomes untouchable. Said it was actually a form of the same problem, just dressed up differently. I thought about that. Not dismissively, actually thought about it. And I said I understood why she saw it that way, but that from inside the experience, it didn't feel like pulling away. It felt like standing still for the first time. The movement had been the drifting, the reactive apologizing, the constant low-grade uncertainty about who I was. That was the motion, not this. She didn't have an answer for that. She left that night without us deciding anything. I sat in the quiet apartment after she left. Not sad, not angry, just aware in a way I hadn't been during most of the relationship. I could see the thing clearly now. The relationship had been built on me being incomplete, and she'd liked being the complete one. Not out of cruelty, just out of human nature. It felt good to be the one with direction when you were with someone without it. The problem was I'd finally gotten some direction. And it turned out she didn't actually want that. The week after was strange. She texted a few times like things were normal, suggested dinner, sent a link to something she thought I'd find interesting. I went along with it once. We met for food. It was fine. We talked, laughed a couple times, but there was nothing underneath it. Both of us performing the relationship instead of having it. She mentioned that her friend had said something that annoyed her. Apparently, the friend had heard what was going on and said it sounded like Logan grew up. Lacey said she'd said it in this tone like it was an obvious good thing, like that was supposed to be the end of the conversation. I didn't say anything back, just nodded. But I thought about it later. Her friend saw it more clearly than she did. Sometimes the people outside of things see the shape of it better than the people inside. A few days passed, and I kept thinking about the call I needed to make. Not obsessively, just the way you think about something you know you have to do. Eventually, I called her. Evening. She picked up on the second ring. I said I'd been thinking about everything, and I thought we should end things. She was quiet for a moment. Asked if this was about the conversation we'd had. I said it wasn't any one thing. Said I thought we wanted different things from each other, and that had probably been true for longer than either of us had admitted. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. She asked if we could talk in person. I said I didn't think it would change what I was thinking, but I'd come by to get the few things I had at her place. She said, okay. Went over the next afternoon. She opened the door and looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, like she'd been expecting something else, maybe hoping I'd show up differently, not sure what differently meant in this case. I said, hey. She stepped back to let me in. I found my things, a jacket, a charger, a book I'd lent her. She stood in the middle of the room watching me. When I had everything, I went over and hugged her, told her to take care of herself. She said my name once, softly, like there was more coming. Nothing came. I walked to the door, said, take care again, and left. Walked down the hall to the elevator. Didn't look back. Not a dramatic choice, not making a point. Just nothing left to look back for. The weeks after were quieter than I expected. I thought there'd be more to process, but mostly there wasn't. Some nights I'd feel the absence of her in the routine. The texts that used to come, the plans on weekends, the particular weight of another person in your life. But it was more like adjusting to a silence than grieving a loss. The gym filled some of the time. The job filled more of it. Started enrolling in the certification program I'd been thinking about, actually paid the enrollment fee, and started the first module. It was slower going than I expected, but it was real. Pages actually read, concepts actually absorbed, assignments actually turned in. My bank balance looked better than it ever had. Those two things together, the savings and the forward movement, changed how I walked around. It's hard to explain, but when you have even a small amount of actual security and an even smaller direction, The weight you carry everywhere just decreases. I stopped having the background hum of, I should be doing something with my life, because I was doing something. Small, unglamorous, but mine. The apartment started reflecting it too. I bought an actual couch, not an expensive one, but one I'd chosen rather than inherited. Put a few things on the walls, nothing artistic, just making the place feel like someone actually lived there intentionally. It's a small thing, but it changes how you feel when you walk through the door. I'd come home from work, and it felt like my place, rather than a place I happened to be staying. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Ran into someone who knew Lacey about a month or so after. Someone from the periphery of her social circle, not a close friend. They asked how I was, said they'd heard we'd ended things. I said yeah, it had run its course, no drama. They said Lacey had been having a hard time with it. I said I was sorry to hear that, and meant it without any complication. They looked at me like they were trying to figure me out, maybe expecting something more loaded from me. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular and went our ways. Thought about it briefly that evening, felt a passing thing for her, some softness, hoped that she was okay, but nothing that pulled at me. It had just been what it was, a relationship that worked until it didn't, and ended when it needed to. The coworker on the day shift, the one who handled scheduling, had become someone I talked to regularly by this point. Not anything intentional, just proximity over weeks and months. She was easy to talk to in the way that some people just are. No performance, no undercurrent, just two people being normal to each other. She laughed at something I said during a pretty tedious moment in the middle of a shift, and I noticed it felt uncomplicated. Not the feeling of managing a dynamic or trying to get something right. Just a person laughing at something I said. I didn't do anything with that, didn't push on it, just noticed it and let it be what it was. The certification program was going steadily by the time several months had passed since the breakup. I'd finished a couple of the modules, had a decent grasp on the material. It was going to open up some positions that paid better and had more of a future than the warehouse. Not because the warehouse was bad, it had been fine, it had kept me going, but it wasn't where I was going to be in 5 years. And for the first time, I actually had an idea of where I was going to be in 5 years. Not a detailed blueprint, just a direction. A path that I'd chosen rather than just a path I'd fallen onto. There's a difference between those two things that's hard to articulate, but you feel it. I think about Lacey sometimes, honestly. Not with bitterness, not with longing, just sometimes. I think about that specific evening she told me I was like a child, about how I sat on the couch in the quiet after she went to the bathroom, and how the thing that hit me wasn't shame or anger. It was just recognition. She was right. She said the thing, and it was right. The irony is that she never actually wanted me to take it seriously. Or maybe she did in theory, but not in practice. In practice, the thing that made the relationship work was me being the one without direction. The one she could guide and instruct and be more together than. A guy who actually grows up removes the need for that. And it turned out the need was load-bearing. I don't think she was aware of that distinction. I think she genuinely believed she wanted me to grow up. People often believe they want things they don't actually want. What she wanted was a version of growing up that still kept me at a certain distance from her level. Close enough to seem like progress. Far enough that she was still ahead. That's not a criticism exactly. It's just how the dynamic was built and what it required to keep running. When I closed the gap, it broke the machine. Not dramatically, just quietly stopped working. She'd said men needed to grow up. She said men avoided accountability, avoided responsibility, hid from adulthood behind screens and games. Said it frequently and with genuine conviction. And then, when she had one who just quietly went and did those things, she didn't want that either. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not to be smug about it, just because it's genuinely interesting. The thing she said I needed to do was apparently not actually the thing she needed me to do. What she needed was for me to try and fail, or to try and need her help, not to just do it and stop needing the help. I've thought about this more than I probably should, not obsessively, just as a thing that surfaces sometimes when I'm driving or in the shower. There's a version of that conversation where I get defensive, and we have a big fight about it, where I spend the next few weeks trying to prove to her that she was wrong, and nothing changes. There's a version where I go quiet and resentful and start pulling away passive-aggressively, and the relationship slowly rots from the inside. There's a version where I just apologize and try harder at the same things that weren't working, and 6 months later, she says it again and means it more. The version that actually happened was the one where I just quietly said, okay, and went and did the thing. No announcement, no declaration. Just started. Sitting in my apartment. One evening, later in the year, the place looks different than it did. Actual furniture, actual food in the fridge, actual stuff on the walls. Nothing fancy but deliberate. I chose what's here instead of just accumulating it. Eating something I cooked, which is still nothing impressive, but it's mine. The certification is almost done. Already had a few conversations about next steps. Things are genuinely in motion in a way I didn't know how to create before. My friend comes over more now, and when we talk, it's different than it used to be. More real, less floating. I have things to say about my own life, which sounds like a small thing, but it isn't really. When you've spent years having nothing to say about your own life, you notice when that changes. He said recently that I seem like a different person. I said I think I'm just actually a person now. He laughed and said that tracks. We sat there for a while just talking about nothing in particular, not filling silence to fill it, just comfortable. I used to find that kind of evening kind of empty. Now it's one of the better kinds. The coworker and I had grabbed food a few times by then. Still easy? Still uncomplicated? I wasn't in a rush about any of it, just letting things be what they are at the pace they naturally go, which is also new for me. Before I'd either been too passive or too anxious, depending on the situation. Now I was just present, not performing anything, not managing anything, just actually there. I don't have a clean moral to hand out at the end of this. It's not really a story with a lesson. It's just something that happened. A girl told me to grow up, and I did. And when I did, she didn't know what to do with that. And I moved on. I think there's something there about what people say versus what they actually want. But I'm not going to turn that into a whole thing. She wasn't a villain. I wasn't a victim. We were just two people in a dynamic that stopped working when one of the people changed. That's all. I'm doing fine. Actually better than fine. Which is the part that surprises me most. Not in some triumphant way. Just quietly, genuinely better. I grew up. Turned out that was all it took. And turned out it was enough.